finished up talking about two-dimensional art last time. So what we're going to do is talk about three-dimensional art today. And we're going to start with sculpture. And let me find the file. Where is the file? Go down. There we go. Here we go. And again, this is talking mainly about materials and techniques that are used for creating art when we're talking about three-dimensional art. Let me see, which light is that? There it is. Okay. So, we talked about two-dimensional art for the last few times, and at that time I talked about that two-dimensional art is height and width. Well, the difference with three-dimensional art is that there's depth. In other words, it occupies space. It's something that you have to walk around or you have to walk within if it's three-dimensional. And three-dimensional applies not only to sculpture but also to architecture. And so particularly in architecture, you can have what are called voids. And what voids are, they're the empty spaces. For example, this room, we wouldn't really discuss it as a void, but that technically is the term that's used for a room like this in a building. It's the void. It's an empty space or volume. And that's what creates the depth, in architecture. It can also be used in sculpture as well, and we will see a few examples where we can talk about voids being in sculptures as well. So we're going to start talking first of all about sculpture, and then we'll talk about architecture next after we finish this lecture. And the chapters that are covered by this are chapters 11, which is the chapter on sculpture. And then part of what I'm going to talk about today is actually in the next chapter, which is chapter 12. Chapter 12 is the crafts chapter. And I'm going to be talking to you about clay. And clay is usually defined as being a craft material rather than being a sculptural material. A long time ago in the 17th century, the 18th century, when people began to talk about fine art, they defined fine art as being painting, sculpture, and architecture. And they defined those three different mediums by the kind of materials that are used. And at that time, they just decided clay is something that's usually used to create a functional object. So we won't call that fine art. We'll call it a crafts. And so even though today we do create sculptures out of clay, and I'm going to show you an example of some figures that the ceramics teacher, the clay teacher in this department made, even though, figures are made, large-scale figures are made out of clay, clay is still kind of considered a craft medium, and so it's in a separate chapter in your book. So I want you to mainly look at the first part of that chapter that discusses clay. And I gave you on the schedule of readings specific things to read in that chapter. So we're first going to talk about, more traditional kinds of sculpture that are, defined as being fine arts today. And sculpture can be divided into several different types. The first of all, what we generally think of sculpture, I think, at least that's what I did when I first started studying art. If somebody had said, what is sculpture? I'd say, well, it's figures, big figures you can walk around. And that's what you're looking at here. This kind of sculpture we call freestanding sculpture. And all that means is that you could walk around it if you wanted to. You would be able to look at it from the back, from any of the sides. And so it's freestanding. In other words, it's not attached to anything. And so the problem for sculptors when they are working with something like this is to try and figure out how do I draw the viewer around this sculpture, because they've spent the time creating it from all the sides. And so there must be something, and usually there is, that they want you to see from the back. So how do they get you to walk around it? And so they do it in several ways, and you see some of those ways here in this example. This is by a late 19th century artist named Rodin, and these are called the Burghers of Calais. This is a commemorative monument that he was asked to make in the 19th century to commemorate something, an event that had happened in the 14th century during the 100 Years' War, when England and France were fighting each other. At one point, England laid a siege onto Calais. They completely surrounded it from the sea as well as from the land, and they determined that they were going to starve the people to death in that city unless the people of the city gave up, surrendered to them. And finally, after quite a while, of trying to withstand this siege, eventually the leaders of the city, and that's what Rodin was asked to represent here, although these aren't portraits, he didn't know what they really look like. But these are supposed to be the leaders of the city, eventually went to the English and said, what can we do to stop the siege? And the English said, you can give yourselves up as our prisoners. We're going to take you to England. We're going to execute you. But your city will be saved. And actually, Calais, from that point onwards until the 20th century, was a seaport that was owned by England rather than by France, even though it was on the French coast. And they only gave it back in the 20th century to France. So that was what the subject was, that Rodin was asked to commemorate here in this sculpture. And so he, determined, or he decided, I want to create very individualized expressions. He thought, how would a person feel if, they're giving up their life for their city? What kind of emotions would they go through in that case? They know they're going off to die. And so he decided that each of the figures would show a separate sort of emotion. And since we can't really see this figure here or this figure that's right behind this man here, he wants us to move around and look at them so that we get the full expression, the full thing that he was trying to create. And so he did a couple of different things primarily in order to give us that sense that we need to move around. He disguised these two figures. We can't really see much of the expression in the face of this man right here. He's holding his hand up to his eyes, to his face, sort of concealing his face from us. And so Rodin, hopes that, we'll want to walk around and see the other side because of that, because he's disguised something. We can't see it clearly. And the same thing is true of this figure right behind this man right here. We can't entirely see what's going on. And so he hopes in that way, just by the subject matter, the strong expression, and then by disguising part of that expression, it'll cause us to want to move around. Then another thing that he did, that artists will often do, is he tried to create a line, particularly in this arm right here, but also the way that this man turns away from us. He's sort of leaning towards that direction, to sort of say to us, come on, move around with me, curve around so that you see the other side. And often artists will use a line either in the garments or the gestures of the figures to try and get you to move around in that way, to show you that they want you to go around. So in that way, he's trying to solve this problem, that most people are going to look at a sculpture and look at it from one angle and say, okay, I understand it, or, I don't understand it, and just walk on and not really take the time to move all around it. Another thing that artists have to do is try to figure out, how they're going to make full-scale figures and these are made out of bronze. Bronze is a very heavy material. How he's going to make them stand. One problem for sculptors is always gravity. They have to be very careful that when they're developing their figures, that they give very solid bases, that the length of this leg and the foot here is really strong enough to support that figure. And here, with these figures, what he did, besides, using the feet and the leg that he shows right here, he also used the drapery. It falls to the base that they're standing on, so it's attached to the base, and it also serves as a element of stability, to help these figures stand. So, freestanding sculpture since it's not attached, it has certain problems. How you get people to go around it, how you make sure that it doesn't fall down, in the wind, or someone bumps against it or something happens to it. So freestanding is one kind of sculpture. And then another kind is called relief sculpture, and you see an example of that here in this particular work. And what relief sculpture is, it's sculpture that is attached to a background. In the case of this, again, we're looking at a bronze, something made out of bronze. It's a bronze plaque. It would have been made by the artist, and then it would have been attached to a door or a wall. If it had been meant for a wall, it would have been attached to a wall. Or sometimes relief sculpture is in stone, and it's carved out of the stone that's a part of that wall. So in either case, relief sculpture is somehow attached to a background. So we can't look at it from the back. So the artist doesn't really worry about leading us around it, because we're never going to see the back of it. And it's not meant to be seen from the back. It's only meant to be seen from the front. And so in many ways, relief sculpture is like painting. You're looking at it from one point of view only. And so they get rid of that one problem, of making you, trying to lead you around the sculpture to see it from the back. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have dimension of depth, within it. It isn't like a painting in that it's flat. If we could actually go up and touch this, we would be able to feel that these figures that are standing out here in the front of the work, what is the foreground of the work, that they actually project from the background very deeply. And we can actually define relief in many different ways. We can define it as high relief, and that's what these figures are. If we could feel them, it would almost feel like, they were completely rounded. They're actually attached to the background, but they project very highly, very strongly from the background. The definition of high relief is that if you think of a piece of stone or a metal plaque as being a certain depth, then anything that's high relief is at least half of that depth. It's not the way they work. They don't start out with a flat slab of stone. They do of metal in this case. In stone they would. And then they would carve back the stone until the figures were about half the thickness of whatever that thickness of the stone is. But when you're working with metal, they don't do that, of course. So, it's simply a case of calculating how strongly they want those figures to project out, and they want them to look like they're almost detached from the background. And so when that happens, that's what we call high relief. When some of the figures look like they're very, projecting out very strongly, as if we could even pick them up and take them out. And then in the background, you see another kind of relief. And in the background, these arches, are hardly raised at all from the background. If we could feel it, again, it would feel very flat. And there would be very little projection of these arches, just a little. It's a very shallow sort of relief. And so that's what we call a low relief. So here we have a combination of high relief in these figures here in the front, very low relief in the background. Another example of low relief are the coins that you have in your pockets or in your purses. The quarters, if you've ever felt them, there's actually a ridge that goes around the quarter. And if you feel the image on it, you can feel that it's a little bit raised from the background. But again, they're very shallow. And so our money that we use, our coins that we use, we would call low relief also. So in low relief, they don't have to bother about leading us around. Any suggestion of depth, of three-dimensionality, is simply in how high the figures or whatever is represented seem to project from the background. There are also different kinds of relief that have been used in various periods of time. This is an example of a type of relief that the Mayans used to carve all of their sculptures when they were living in Mexico. And this is what we call flat relief. And what is meant by that, it's as if this stone, and this is a stone relief that we're looking at, it's as if there are just two levels that we see here. We see the level where the figures are, and then we have a background, a flat background. And if you look at the figures, if we could run, it looks like they're three-dimensional because if you look at the edges of them, they look like they're rounded, as if they're projecting, very strongly from space. But if you could run your hand over them, you would realize that that roundness is just on the edge, and all of these details that you see here are all very flat. And it would feel, if you ran your hand over it, like this was just a flat level, that everything was on the same level. The depiction of the man, this is one of the kings of the Mayans. He was called Bird Jaguar. And this is a prisoner that he's probably getting ready to sacrifice, since they had human sacrifice. But if we could run our hands over any of the figural elements within this scene, we'd realize it's all very flat. And really, any roundness is almost just an illusion by just the way they treat the edges to make them sort of rounded off. So it gives us that suggestion that we're looking at something very rounded that's projecting out when it really isn't, projecting very strongly. And then in Egypt, they used a different kind of relief. It's called sunken relief. And instead of having the figure here, this is Pharaoh that we're looking at from the New Kingdom. Instead of having his head and his neck project out towards us, they carved it into the surface. So, in the typical relief that we just looked at, anything that was not a part of the figure, such as this area right here, or over on the other side, all of these, what we called, and what I talked about before, as negative areas, the parts that are background. In any of the other relief forms that we looked at, this would have been behind the figure. It would have been deeper into the figure. It'd have a shallow background, and the figure would have projected forwards. But the Egyptians, probably because of the light, the very strong light in Egypt, they discovered that the figures showed up better if they used this kind of a relief, where the figure was carved into the surface, and the background was allowed to be the top of the surface. So this image is really lower in level than the negative areas here that surround it. So there are different kinds of relief forms that have been created in the history of art, but they're all basically the same, definition. They're a sculpture that's attached to some sort of background, a building or a column or something else serves as the background for these reliefs to be attached to. Then there are some other types of sculpture that have developed primarily in the 20th century. For example, first of all, I'm going to talk about kinetic sculpture. Anything that has movement is called kinetic sculpture. Kinetic, being the important word there, meaning that it has movement of some kind. And Alexander Calder, an American artist, was the first one to really experiment with trying to find some way of incorporating actual movement into sculpture. Another problem for sculptors has been that a lot of the time they wanted things to look like there was movement in the sculpture, but you're working with a very solid, stable object that never moves. So how do you get, that sense of movement? And they usually use drapery as a way of trying to do it. They try to make the drapery look like it was blowing in the wind. But when you touched it, you realized that it wasn't moving. It was all an illusion of wind. So what Alexander Calder tried to do was figure out, how can I create something that will actually move? And since it occupies space, which we said was, one definition for sculpture, we call it a sculpture. Even though the individual pieces, like this fish right here, is a very flat piece. It's made out of a piece of metal that's been painted, a very flat piece of metal. And then we have wires here that, define some of the other forms. So they're only marginal as far as having much solid volume to them. But because they occupy space and they move in that space, we still qualify this as being a sculpture. The kind of sculpture that he created are called mobiles. Or mobiles, but usually in art they're pronounced mobiles. And they move by passive movement. Wind causes them to move. There's no motor attached to them. And so it's simply a case of carefully balancing. He used O-rings where he attached the different wire rods to the other pieces. All of these are O-rings, so that when wind hits this, it can cause each of the pieces to move independently. And so you get all these different kinds of combinations of form. He had studied engineering, and that probably was the knowledge that he had that he was able to use in order to finally create sort of, these kinds of mobiles that you see here. The problem with mobiles often is that they're inside of museums and there's no air circulating in the museums, and so you don't see them moving. They look very flat. They never seem to move in space. But some museums have hung them where there is a very gentle sort of breeze that hits them, and so you do see them constantly moving and constantly changing. And I think that's better, for what he was trying to do, where he was trying to show movement. His ideas of using passive sorts of sources of movement led to other artists in the 20th century that began to use motors to create movement. And this is one of the first artists that did that. His name is Jean Tinguely, and he was an artist from France. And another thing that develops in the 20th century is artists wanting to use things that already exist. They feel in sort of an ecological sort of way that, why should we create more clutter in our world? Let's see if we can't just use the clutter, the junk in other words, and create something sculptural out of it. And Jean Tinguely was one of the first to begin to do that also. So he would take anything he found, in a dump, old motors from different kinds of machines, levers, baby carriages, anything that he found that he thought he could incorporate into a sculptural form, he would use. And he would, find a motor to use with it, and he would set it up so that when he turned the motor on, the different pieces of the sculpture would begin to move. And they often made noise, too, because he usually used old motors that didn't run very well. And so they often squeaked and shook and, made all kinds of noises as while they were turned on. And so he made this motorized sculpture for the opening of a sculpture garden in New York City. a very famous 20th century museum in New York City is a museum of modern art. It has lots of the art that we're going to be looking at before too long, that was produced in the 20th century. And they opened a sculpture garden in 1960 to show off the sculptures that they owned in an outdoor setting. And so he created this for the big reception where they invited all these wealthy people to come to see their new sculpture garden. And the idea of this work was that he would turn on the motor and it would start shuddering and shaking and whining and making noise, and it just start shaking itself until it destroyed itself. That was the whole idea. But what you see here is a photograph that was taken of it after he turned it on, and it caught fire instead of just shaking itself to death. And the head of the museum became concerned that the museum might burn down, and so they called the fire trucks and they put it out. And so in a way it failed. His purpose was to have it shake itself to death, and it didn't do it because it caught on fire and they had to put it out. So, this is just one of the first examples of motorized sorts of sculptures that are still being made today by other sculptors. Then another type of art form that has been developed that's usually classified as sculpture is performance art. And, this could also be an art form that could be discussed in the theater department, in a theater class. Sometimes there's music involved with it, so performance art is really something that can be claimed by many different arts, not just the visual arts. Here you're looking at a man who was one of the first to create performance art. His name was Joseph Beuys. He was a German, and you see him holding a stuffed rabbit in his arms, and the title of his performance piece was How to Explain Pictures to a Dead Hare. He also did other sculptural forms and paintings, and so the first time that he had this performance, he performed it at the reception for an art show that he was holding. And so lots of people were there that he had invited to that art show. And he came in, dressed as you see him here. He had covered his face with beeswax and with fat, and then he had pressed gold leaf on his face. And there's a reason for the fat, anyway, that I'll mention here in a minute. And so he made his face look, rather weird in appearance. And then he was walking around in the exhibit with this dead rabbit in his arms, and he would stop at different works of art that he had created, and he'd whisper to the rabbit as if he were explaining, what he had done to the rabbit. And when anybody got close to try and listen to him, he'd stop, because the idea that he was trying to say by the title of this piece and by what he was doing in this performance, he was trying to say that he believed if you had to explain art to someone, they were too stupid to understand it anyway. That they ought to be able to get it on their own. I don't happen to agree about that, or I wouldn't be teaching art history, if I didn't believe that, some things I say sort of, make a difference to people. But many artists believe that. They believe, that their art form should say it all. That they shouldn't have to explain it to anyone, and if they have to, it probably doesn't matter anyway. The person's not going to understand their explanation. And so he was one of the first to create performance art. Now, I said I would explain why he put fat on his face. He had been a Luftwaffe pilot in World War II. And he was shot down over the Crimea, which is the southern area of Russia at that time. It no longer belongs to Russia, but at that time it was the southern part of Russia. And the area was a very uninhabited area. The only people that lived in this particular area where his plane went down were nomadic people. And these people found him. And he was, he had been hurt. And so, and it was winter, and the Crimea is very cold. And so they had found the felt blankets in his plane, and they wrapped him in felt blankets. They covered his body with animal fat because that was what they believed would help warm your body, was to be covered with a layer of animal fat. And then they wrapped the felt blankets on top of that. And he survived. And so for the rest of his life, he worked with fat and with felt blankets a lot in his sculptural pieces because he saw them as life-giving substances. He saw them as almost having a spiritual quality or a miraculous sort of quality. And so that's part of the reason that, he used fat on his face. Also, fat's a good sticky substance that will hold the gold leaf, along with the beeswax. That'll hold gold leaf to the face, and he wanted to look different. He didn't want to just look ordinary or just like he always looked every day in order to make this statement. He wanted to somehow look very different. He starts the idea of performance art, and there are many people that have continued to make performance art. Perhaps one of the best known today is Laurie Anderson. And she began to do performance art in the 1970s. I know she's been on MTV and she's been on several television programs. She started out as a musician, playing a violin on the street, and then she began to, or she decided, that wasn't enough, that people weren't understanding that she was somehow different from just all the other musicians that they saw, playing on street corners in big cities. And so she then decided to wear ice skates and to have those ice skates frozen into a block of ice. And then she would stand in the ice skates and she would play her violin until the ice melted, so that she could be released from the block of ice. And then she went on, and this is just one still from a performance that's called From the United States Part 2. And now she uses electronic music instruments. She distorts her voice. She not only distorts the music she's playing, but she also distorts her voice. She uses visual images that are projected onto screens, such as the United States map with the time zones indicated here, and creates, performance pieces that are often rather long. They take, some time to go through. They're almost like theater performances in the way that she creates her performances piece. So performance art, because it involves a human body, is thought of as sculptural too. And it involves the human maybe walking around in a lot of space in some kind of environment. And so that's why it's been defined as being a sculptural art as well. And then we've already mentioned earlier, a couple of different times, I've talked about installations. And I've shown you this work before. Installation is another and a new type of sculptural form that's being created now by a lot of artists. It's probably one of the more popular ways to create art these days. And it involves a very large room, usually. In other words, there's a lot of space incorporated within it. As you see here, the artist may paint on the walls and combine the painting on the walls with actual sculptural forms, three-dimensional forms that the artist has created. Maybe combining it with objects that the artist has found, in the environment or out in the dump or wherever. And so an entire room is created. And when the viewer walks into that room, you sort of become a part of the sculpture. And it's all around you. It really surrounds you in a three-dimensional sort of way. And so this has been one of the later developments. It happened in the late 20th century, and it's still a very popular form of art today. Now, I'm going to talk about some of the materials and some of the techniques that are used in creating these different kind of art forms. And we're first going to talk about the traditional materials and techniques. In other words, things that have been done for hundreds of years, going all the way back, really, to, in some cases, to the beginning of art in, the Paleolithic period of time. There are two general categories of sculptural techniques that have been used for centuries. They're called additive, and what is meant by that is that the sculpture is made by putting things together, building up the sculpture. And the materials that are usually used are clay, plaster, sometimes wax. If you think about, I'm sure probably many of you have used modeling clay or Play-Doh at some point in your lives, and maybe made up several little balls and then attached them together, or made a snake maybe, and did something with the snake, added ears to it or something like that. In other words, you're putting pieces together to form the final product, the final sculpture. And so that's what's meant by building up with clay or wax or plaster, and it's an additive technique. And then the other traditional technique has been subtractive, and that means you take away from some material that you're working with. You carve it. And the usual materials that have been used for this technique are wood and stone. You take a block of stone and you use chisels and hammers. You begin to chip away from that stone until you create a form, whatever form you're trying to create. And so you're subtracting away from that block of stone. So these are the two general categories. And I just want to talk a little bit about some of the different techniques that are used in these categories. For the additive technique, for using clay or plaster or wax, the primary technique is called modeling. And modeling is a term I've used before in this class when I was referring to a painter using light and dark to create a form that looks three-dimensional but is really flat. It's on a flat surface. Well, this kind of modeling is where you actually take materials and maybe you squeeze it or you manipulate it in some way, you change its form, and out of that changing of the form, you create an image similar to what you're seeing here. This is a little figure that goes back to the Neolithic period, very long ago, around 3000 BCE. It's called a fertility figure, but we don't know what it was used for exactly. It was found in Mesopotamia, probably made there. It seems to represent a woman. She has breasts. She has a very large belly button, or some people think this might have been a necklace and that she might have had painted strings that we no longer see that would have been attached to this projection right here. The breasts have been added to the basic form. This projection for the belly button's been added. They've added hair onto the basic form, the nose, the eyes. So in other words, this is an additive technique, modeling. Another technique that can be used also, it's not demonstrated by this little figure. I don't have an exact slide I can show you, is a technique that's used even today. Artists sometimes will use clay and modeling in order to make a sketch for a later work of art. And so it sort of serves the same purpose as drawing does sometimes for a painter, for example, who will make a drawing before they make the painting. And when a sculptor uses clay in this way, sometimes he wants to make a full-scale sculpture But he doesn't, and he wants to make it out of clay. Well, clay is not a very stable material. If you don't have some kind of armature, and that's where, which means a metal casing or some kind of metal form, that's the basis for this clay sculpture, the clay will fall apart. And so they will make the sort of general contours of the form using a piece of metal, or it could be a steel mesh, it could be any kind of metal structure, and they'll create an armature, and then on top of that armature they'll put the clay to create this form that they're eventually going to make in some other material. It won't be, it's just to make a sketch, to see what it's going to look like. Clay, as I said and I mentioned earlier, is still used today. And I know that the teacher here who teaches clay would probably object to being called a craftsman, because she does make, pots and things, bowls and traditional sort of forms like that out of clay. But she also creates sculptural figures like you're seeing here. Many of these are small scale. These are about between 2 and 3 feet in height, but she makes full scale figures out of clay. If you look at the figure in front of Martin Allen, just in front of Rarick here, that figure was made by our ceramic teacher, and she's that figure is almost a life-size figure that she's made out of clay, using clay only. And so clay is still used today to create figural forms, and it's not just to create functional objects like pots or coffee cups or things like that, but it's still classified in the crafts area in your book. But we tend to think of it, as being a little bit higher in form. We call it just another fine art here in this department. This is an example of a clay figure that was then later cast in bronze. And this was made by Rodin, once again, that made those first figures that we looked at, the Burghers of Calais. This is over life size. And so he would have used an armature, a metal base, on which he would have then put clay in order to create the form that you see here, all the detailed anatomy. Up here we can see the chest muscles and the bone structure in the chest muscles. This whole thing was created as just a model for a figure that he later created in bronze, like the Burghers of Calais that we looked at. And so whenever artists create these large-scale models out of clay, they have a name. They're called maquettes. So a maquette is like a sketch. It's like the sketches that Michelangelo did before he painted the Sistine Chapel. So this is a sketch done three-dimensionally using clay for a figure that was going to be made in bronze, in another material. This was used, it's called Walking Man, is what they call this particular figure, but this figure was a maquette for a statue of St. John the Baptist that Rodin was making. And it has an interesting story behind it, because he had made an earlier life-size figure of a nude man, and he showed it in an exhibit, and all the people in Paris at the time looked at that figure, and they believed that he had made molds of a real person. And that was not the proper way to create sculpture at that time. And so he was criticized, that he doesn't know how to really sculpt. He just makes molds of people and then, casts them in clay or bronze. And he, defended himself and said, no, I did not make a mold of any particular person. I did this all by hand. And so he decided to make an over life-size figure, and this was the result. in order to prove, that he could make something that looked very realistic, looked exact, like you were seeing the muscles and the underlying skeletal structure, that he could actually do it by hand himself and not use a mold. And he deliberately made it over life size so that they couldn't say, oh no, you copied again. We know you copied some figure. And so this just, it's been cast in bronze. It's no longer clay because the clay would have deteriorated. Clay, if it isn't baked in an oven, is brittle. And rain will make it crumble. It breaks very easily if it's hit or if it topples over. And so this was later, after his death, cast into bronze so that we would be able to keep it for history, sake, for studying what he did, and so it wouldn't crumble away. So it's now in bronze, but it was never meant to be in bronze. With clay, whenever you're working with clay, you do have to go through certain procedures in order to make it permanent. And clay has been used for finished products, such as the ones we saw that the ceramic teacher made, or this example right here, which was made in the Renaissance. And in order to make it a permanent, finished work of art, it has to be baked in an oven. And so baking it in an oven is called firing. So it's just a term. Instead of saying baking, we say firing. And the ovens are called kilns, K-I-L-N, instead of calling them ovens. So it's just a case that we have this specialized language for something, that's a common sort of process. When ceramic is baked, or clay, I should say, has been baked, it comes out usually with a reddish sort of cast, and that is called terracotta. And then often after it comes out from the first baking in an oven, and is this reddish sort of cast, they will then treat it with a glaze. And sometimes the glaze is done before it's baked. It just depends on the kind of clay that is being used and the processes. They put a glaze on it, and glaze is like the glaze we talked about in oil paint. It's a very thin, transparent material that is put onto ceramic, and then the ceramic is baked again. The clay is baked again, or terracotta as it is at that point. It's baked again, and the glaze turns in the heat of the fire into different colors based upon what chemical makeup the glaze has. And so that's how the color that you see here in this particular example, the blues and greens, the yellows, all of these are different chemical glazes that were used by Luca della Robbia in order to create these colors in the final product. When it's all finished, another term that's usually used for baked clay is ceramics, but that usually means the finished product, after whatever has been done, the coloring, anything that's been done to make it a finished work of art. That's when they call it a ceramic. And when it's a terracotta, it's usually not entirely finished. And so the della Robbia family, the whole family, there were several brothers and there was a father. They made images like this. You can see them in Florence on almost every street corner, on buildings that were built during the Renaissance period of time. They all have religious sorts of images, such as the Virgin Mary and the Christ child that you see here. And they're just placed on the corners of the buildings or the street corners in Florence. They almost served as like signs, to tell people which street you were on at that time. Then clay can also be used in sort of a secondary process. This process would still be called additive because clay is involved in it. But it's a step further than clay. Clay, in this instance, is only used to make the models for the resulting forms. And the process is called casting, and what happens in casting is that metal is melted and poured into a mold, and then when it cools, it hardens, and we have a metal sculpture. And the usual materials that were used for most of the period of time were bronze or gold. Silver could be used. Any metal could be used in order to create sculptures using this casting process. And here you just see the different steps that a sculptor has to go through. This whole process is called cire perdue, down here at the bottom, CIREPERDUE, CIREPERDUE. What that means, it means lost wax. And this was sort of a traditional method. And the reason it developed, and it had developed by the Celtic period of time, the ancients knew about this technique, and it's pretty much stayed the same down to the present day. The reason that this developed is that if you're working with metal and you're creating a life-size figure, it's going to be tremendously heavy. You could hardly move it. And it'd be very expensive, if it were solid and it had, was completely made of bronze. So this technique was developed because this technique creates just a thin shell of that metal. And so what they start out with is they make a clay model, of the original out of plaster clay. And then what's used today, the way that it's done today, is they take a rubber and they create a mold of that clay image that they've made. And so you get a mold of each side of the figure. And then, the clay model is no longer needed at that point. And then what they do is they take, both sides of these molds and they put a layer of wax on the inside of the mold. They attach wax rods that go from where the wax is, or rubber, whichever you're using, whether it's wax or rubber, you can use. They use rubber now. And you put little rods that go out to the outside of this mold that you've made. And so here you see the wax rods that go out to the outer part of the mold. Then inside they will put, it's called investment, and what it is, it's a plaster that they fill the interior with, and then they put the two pieces together. They clamp them together. They cover them with plaster sometimes. Here they're using plaster, all of this area right here to this broken line. All of this is plaster, and then outside usually there will be a layer of sand as well. And then they melt the metal, whatever metal they're using, and they pour it in to an opening that they leave, usually at the bottom of the sculpture. They pour it in, and it goes into any of these areas where wax has been placed, and it melts the wax out. And they have it, you can't really tell here, but there is a way. They have an exit so that the wax can melt out and flow away, and it's replaced by metal. And then as the metal dries and cools, eventually when they calculate it's cool enough, and they can tell because they can test the metal for its temperature. They then crack away all of the plaster, and then they have to cut away these rods because where the wax rods were have now been filled with metal. So they cut those away, and then they finish the surface, and you have a figure that is metal on the outside, and then usually through the hole here at the bottom they will crack and they will break out the plaster that's inside, so that you have a figure that's hollow on the inside and just has this thin layer of metal on the outside that's defining the form. I'm not going to ask you to explain step by step this process, Just know, what basically this lost wax sort of process is. But I wouldn't ask you to go into great detail explaining it. So this is what is called casting, to use melted metal and to create a form, such as this, which is not solid. You could, smaller sculptures sometimes are solid, but even smaller sculptures would be very heavy if they were entirely solid. And so this comes under the heading of being another additive sort of process that's being created.
I'm sorry, on that lost wax,
yeah.
Which one of those slides there was the excess wax?
Oh, they're not showing it to you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they don't show you the vents that are taking place. The vents actually are these rod forms here, and that's how it comes out. But, yeah, the way they drew it, you don't see them. Yeah. Oops, wrong way. So this is the method that Rodin used to create these large-scale figures. They're hollow on the inside. They'd be tremendously expensive and very heavy if they had been solid. And so this is the way that most large-scale bronzes that you see in public parks, places like that, that's how they've been made. And you'll also notice, if you look at sculptures that you see in public parks, that often they seem rather whitish or sometimes sort of green in color. That is caused by a patina. Patina is the thing that can sometimes be created deliberately by an artist, and there are materials today that sculptors can buy in order to create a certain color for their bronzes. But most of the old sculptures that you see in parks and what you see here with Rodin, the patina happened naturally. He did not plan it. He did not add a material to the surface to give it this patina, this color that you're seeing here. Because what patina is, it's oxidation. It is the bronze being oxidized by the pollutants in the air. By the sulfurs and the different kind of things that we have in our air. And so a lot of the sculptures look greenish or sort of white, almost as if they have chalk on them, or sometimes sort of brown or gray. And as a result of this oxidation, a lot of these sculptures have been taken inside. They're inside museums now because they're just rotting away from all the pollution that we have in our cities. If you go to Venice, for example, there are some very famous horses, bronze horses, that are on the top of San Marco, St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice. And the ones that you see today are duplicates that have been made. And the actual bronze horses that were there originally are now inside of the church in order to protect them from this damage. And actually, when we were there over spring break, we were talking to somebody who said that they were getting ready to take the duplicates that they had put on the outside of St. Mark's inside to restore them because they were getting eaten away by all the pollutants in the air. So a lot of times you don't see these outside anymore, not the originals anyway. Artists artists sometimes like to create a deliberate color onto these bronzes, and so they do add these artificial kinds of patinas. I had an art history teacher. He taught Far Eastern art, Chinese art, who was also a sculptor, and he said that one of the best materials to use for creating the patinas on these sculptures was urine. He used his own urine in order to create patinas on his sculpture that he created, and it was just like, ew, I didn't want to know that about you. Another kind of traditional technique is carving, and this comes under the subtractive sort of technique. You're seeing here the kind of tools that are used. The tools that are up at the top are chisels and a hammer, the kind that are used for wood carving. Anybody that's worked with wood, particularly the guys probably, have seen chisels. And then down below you have other chisels, but these are metal and the entire stem is metal. These are for working with stone and carving stone. And so I'm going to start by talking about wood carving, just some of the different approaches that are taken with wood carving. And I might mention that wood carving is in that crafts chapter 2. Nowadays, wood carvings are not considered to be fine art. They're thought of as craft sort of art as well. There are basically two approaches that have been used with wood carvings. You take a piece of wood, and in the past, it was usually the trunk of a tree that the artist would take, or a very large limb of a tree. And so either the artist would stick to the shape of the trunk of the tree or the limb of the tree and would not create anything that projected out, because then that would mean they had to somehow attach those projections. And so that's what you're seeing here in this example. This is a mask. Here's where the head would be for the person that would wear this in various ceremonies and dances that took place in West Africa in the 19th century. But if you look, everything is within an outer contour. There's nothing projecting out. It's almost as if you are seeing a trunk of a tree or a limb of a tree. They're very careful to carve, and to plan out all of their images so they don't have to carve outside of that basic shape. So that's one way that wood carvings are made. And then another way is to use joining, it's called. And that's where you do create forms that project out very strongly away from, what started out as the basic block. So, for example, you see the drapery that, looks like it's fluttering out away from the leg right here, and this hand projects out. Arms, may sometimes project out, or they'll be holding different weapons in their arms. Well, all of these pieces that project out from the basic outline of the form have been added or joined to the basic form of the torso here. This is a guardian figure, and you can't see the face very well, but they always have rather ferocious-looking faces. They're always looking like they're snarling at somebody. And these were placed at the doorways of temples, Buddhist temples in Japan. And the idea was they were supposed to protect the temple from evil spirits, from anyone coming in that was evil that might damage the temple. And so they were meant to frighten off the people. But here, obviously this could not be made of just one large piece. These are very large. I don't remember the exact size of this one, but some of them are up to 20 feet tall, so they're over life size. If you think about finding one piece of wood that'd be that gigantic, it would be hard to find. I mean, we have some, in California that would work, but, most people don't have that large trees to work with. So these are the two basic kinds of methods used for wood. And then for carving, for the tools that are listed here at the bottom, the artist takes a piece of stone and then begins to plan out, the figure, and they can sometimes add pieces. Once again, many of the stones that were made, that were carved in the past, kept to that basic block, or that basic piece of stone. They didn't really project out from it. But later on, the sculptors learned how to attach projecting pieces to the basic form using a similar kind of technique to joining. This is a sculpture that was made by Michelangelo, and the story is that he worked on this 8 days before he died, that he was working on it, and so it's not completed. And so what is so nice about it is that you can see the actual chisel marks. Up here in the drapery, this is the Virgin Mary, and this is Jesus after the crucifixion. So she's holding him up, as she's holding this adult dead body up, supposedly. And so you can see chisel marks in the drapery. If you look at her face looks like it's sort of pockmarked. And that's because in stone carving, they use this kind of tool. It sort of looks like a meat tenderizer, that you can use for meat. And you actually hit the stone, and it does create that sort of pock-marked kind of effect. Later on, we believe, that he would have gone in and he would have carefully removed all the little ridges and bumps that you see there to create a much smoother appearance to the face, but he died in the process of creating it. This was also a piece of stone that he had started carving another figure for, and so he hadn't removed all of that other figure before he died. This arm, for example, that you see right here belonged to that other figure that he was originally going to carve this piece of stone out of, and then changed his mind. And so he would have eventually removed, this evidence of this other arm, and he would have finished the surfaces here of this. So it's nice to have something of Michelangelo so you can actually see, how he went about carving. We've looked at this one before, and this is a good, example of, creating projections that seem to move out away from the basic stone, such as her arm, the way her head is turning away, the way she's sort of pushing his head away. I talked about when we looked at this figure that this artist became known for being able to treat marble as if it, were some other material entirely. You get the feeling when you look at this sculpture, you're looking at flesh. You sort of forget that it's actually marble. It's really hard. He was such an expert at knowing how to carve stone and how to use lights and shadows, to create these different textures. So, in this form, he's using a sort of a joining sort of technique for parts of the form that project out more strongly. Then in the modern ages, in the 20th century, sculptors have adopted kinds of methods that really go back to construction, to the construction field that have nothing to do with traditional ways of creating sculpture. They weld sculptures, they solder, they hammer, they glue, they construct sculptures, they assemble them, sometimes of different parts and different objects. And so modern techniques have varied a great deal from the traditional techniques, and the materials have changed a great deal. For example, this is a work by Dwayne Hansen. He was from Florida. He created sculptures that look ultra realistic. In fact, they're life-size sculptures. They look so realistic that I have watched people come up to them and try to talk to them. And then, they wait for an answer and they don't get an answer, and then you sort of see this foolish look come on their face and they realize, oh my God, I've talked to a sculptor. Sculpture, it's not real. He would make a mold of people, friends he knew, and other people, interesting people that he would see on the street. He would ask them if he could make a plaster mold of them. And often he would use, today rather than using, or not today, he's dead, but in his time, instead of using plaster, sometimes he would use plastic sort of material to make these molds of them. Then after he had the molds, he would use a process similar to lost wax, except he would use fiberglass and plastics and create the basic form of the individual. Then he would put real clothing on them, other accessories like the watch, the purse. All of these are real things, that an actual person could use. He would paint the surface in order to get that effect of flesh, on the surface, real wigs of hair. I've seen some of his sculptures of men primarily where he actually inserted individual hairs into the arms and the chest in order to make them look, very realistic. And he did, just ordinary people. He wasn't interested in gods or famous people. He was just interested in observing life and representing ordinary people in very realistic sort of ways, such as he did here. And we have other artists that have also used the same basic methods of making molds of people and then creating them in plastics and fiberglass. Sculptors also have used materials that come directly out of construction. I-beams. This sculpture is created from I-beams that could have been used for a building. Walter de Maria creates these very large-scale sculptures that are usually only outside. Once in a while you see a smaller one of his that's set up in a museum, but they're really meant to be seen outside, to be seen in relationship to the landscape around it. He wants people to participate in them. He hated the idea that sculpture and art was something you weren't supposed to touch. Stay away, don't get too near, don't touch them. And he wanted people to really interact with them. And so here, for example, you see people that are climbing up the I-beams and getting on this piece that is suspended. It's not attached by anything except a steel cable that goes up to here. There's one, I went to graduate school at the University of Minnesota, and at one of the art galleries there, they have one of these with a swing that you sit right underneath the middle of it, and you can swing back and forth. And it gives you a very weird feeling because, he makes them look like they're just sort of fallen together, like they're not attached. But he actually does weld them and, uses bolts to bolt them together so they won't fall down. But when you're sitting in the swing and you're swinging back and forth and you see this thing up above you, it really gives you the feeling that they're unstable. So he wanted to use new materials, but he also wanted people to interact with them more than a lot of sculpture of the past has been interacted with. Okay, we'll finish up this next time. And then we're going to talk about architecture next time.